These are the government policies quietly adding billions of dollars to what American farmers pay to grow your food, and you're picking up the tab at the grocery store. Between January 2020 and January 2023, grocery prices in the United States jumped 24%. In 2022 alone, food prices spiked nearly 10% in a single year. Most people blame the pandemic, supply chains, and inflation. Sure, those played a role, but there is another force at work here that almost nobody talks about. It starts with something most Americans never think about: dirt, or more specifically, what we put in it. Fertilizer doesn't make headlines, but it accounts for up to 40% of a farmer's operating costs. For corn specifically, that is 22% of total production costs. For wheat, it is 38% of operating expenses. When fertilizer prices go up, the cost of growing food goes up, and when the cost of growing food goes up, you pay more at checkout. It's that simple. So here is the question nobody in Washington wants to answer. Why is the United States government making fertilizer more expensive on purpose? Let's start with a fact that surprises most Americans. The United States imports over 95% of the potash its farmers use. Potash is one of 3 essential nutrients every crop needs to grow. There is no substitute, no workaround. You either have it or your crops suffer. Of that 95% we import, 85 to 90% comes from Canada. Meanwhile, domestic production accounts for less than 1% of global potash output. We produced about 400,000 metric tons in 2023, but consumed 5.3 million metric tons. That gap is enormous. And in February 2025, the Trump administration slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian imports, including potash. Within days after an outcry from farm groups, they reduced it to 10%, but 10% on a product you have no domestic alternative for is still a massive cost increase. At current potash prices of around $450 per ton, full pass-through of a 25% tariff would add more than $100 per ton. Even at 10%, that is real money multiplied across millions of acres. Iowa corn grower Bob Hemerseth put it bluntly: the 10% on potash is not good for the agriculture sector, or for farming, because it just adds another expense to our already high input costs. But potash is only half the story. The other half involves phosphate, and this is where things get truly outrageous. In June 2020, the Mosaic Company filed a petition with the Department of Commerce asking for countervailing duties on phosphate fertilizer imports from Morocco and Russia. Mosaic argued that foreign producers were receiving unfair government subsidies. The Commerce Department agreed, and by 2021, tariffs ranging from 17% to over 47% were imposed. Here's what you need to know about Mosaic. They control over 74% of American phosphate fertilizer production, and they rank as the second largest phosphate producer in the world. When you restrict the imports that compete with them, you are effectively handing a near monopoly even more pricing power. The former chief economist of the American Farm Bureau Federation called the Mosaic petition crony capitalism, saying it would harm the very farmers it claimed to protect. That's exactly what happened. Morocco holds nearly 70% of the world's phosphate reserves and was historically a leading supplier to the US. Before the tariffs, Moroccan imports accounted for more than half of American phosphate needs. After the duties were announced, Morocco's largest exporter, OCP, halted most shipments. Supply shrank, prices climbed, and farmers had fewer places to turn because around the same time, China cut off its phosphate exports entirely. A country that used to provide up to 8 million tons to the global market simply stopped selling. The numbers tell a devastating story. A study from North Dakota State University found that the tariffs collected an estimated $958 million in revenue from agricultural imports in just 9 months. The National Association of Wheat Growers estimates the phosphate duties alone added nearly $1 billion in costs for wheat growers between 2021 and 2025. Across all major crops, the added phosphate fertilizer expense totals roughly $6.9 billion over 5 growing seasons. Here's the detail that should make your blood boil. Researchers analyzed the spread between US and Canadian fertilizer prices and found a pass-through rate of 342%. That means for every dollar of tariff imposed, farmers ended up paying $3.42 more. The tariff didn't just raise prices by the amount of the duty, it gave domestic producers cover to raise their prices far beyond that. Neil Caskey, CEO of the National Corn Growers Association, called it astonishing. "We are heading into the field to plant what will be the most expensive crop in history," he said. The consequences are cascading through the system. Iowa farmer Mark Mueller watched his nitrogen fertilizer jump from $795 per ton to $990 in just a few weeks. "I am more concerned now than I have been in my 30 years of farming," and he told NBC News. Lance Lillibridge, a corn and cattle farmer from Vinton, Iowa, said he plans to use less fertilizer this year. "I'm probably going to see a reduction in yield. When farmers use less fertilizer, they grow less food. When they grow less food, prices go up for everyone." Analysts warn that higher input costs could shift up to 1.5 million acres away from corn and toward soybeans this spring. That means less corn in the supply chain, and in a country where corn is in everything, from livestock feed to cereal to fuel that matters. Meanwhile, farm bankruptcies are surging. Chapter 12 filings hit 315 in 2025, a 46% increase from the year before. The Midwest and Southeast are being hit hardest. Family farm bankruptcies jumped 55% compared to 2023 and are trending even higher. More than 50 state agricultural groups and 8 national farm organizations have formally urged federal trade officials to lift the phosphate tariffs. Even Nutrien, which produces 20% of domestic phosphate and directly benefited from the duties, now says removing them would be a constructive step to support U.S. farmers. When a company that profits from a policy says it has gone too far, you know something is broken. The administration eventually exempted fertilizers from some tariffs in November 2025, but researchers found that as of January 2026, farmers were still paying tariff-induced premiums. Prices went up fast and came down slow, if they came down at all. Meanwhile, a class action antitrust lawsuit has been filed against major fertilizer producers, alleging price fixing and coordinated supply restraint. The Department of Justice is reportedly investigating whether the nation's largest producers colluded to raise prices. So, let's connect the dots. Government policies restricted fertilizer imports, which reduced supply, and which raised prices for farmers. Farmers spent $6.9 billion more than they should have. Some went bankrupt, and others cut back on planting or fertilizer use. That means less food or more expensive food entering the supply chain. Every one of those added costs flows downhill through food manufacturers like Conagra and General Mills, through grocery distributors, and ultimately to you standing in the cereal aisle, wondering why a box of cornflakes costs what it does. As Josh Linville, Vice President of Fertilizer at StoneX, warned, the problem is if we start to upset Canada, where else around the world do we go? To our second biggest supplier, Russia. The final review of the phosphate tariffs is expected in spring 2027. Until then, American farmers will keep paying more to grow the food that feeds this country, and you will keep paying more to buy it, not because of drought, not because of a bad harvest, but because of a policy choice.